Good evening and welcome to the Skeptics Toolbox. This is a program that is sponsored by Center for Inquiry. The Skeptics Toolbox was originally founded by Ray Hyman and a team of skeptics out in Oregon, and they have hosted annual Skeptics Toolbox workshops for over 30 years. And with our move to a lot of online events, we are resurrecting the Skeptics Toolbox idea to expand it to include online webinars and an online website with resources to help our supporters and skeptics and secular individuals around the world to have practical and hands-on tools for them to use to become better skeptics, critical thinkers, so that we can help make the world a more rational and reasonable place. So we're very glad to have you this evening. And if you like what you see tonight, we will be continuing to host more events like this. You can check out the details at skepticstoolbox.org, and that will link you to the main page on our website. And we have the next event that we are going to be hosting for the Skeptics Toolbox series will be on March 9th with Anthony Magnabosco. He is the founder of Street Epistemology International, and he will be giving a talk on how to have non-confrontational discussions, particularly with people that don't agree with you, which is a tool that we need today more than ever, I think. And so he will be joining us on March 9th. And we're also in the process of creating a set of digital online resources that will be under the banner of Skeptics Toolbox that are going to be practical tools that you can use to become a better critical thinker. And some of the resources and things that our speaker tonight will be mentioning will be added to that website as well. So this evening, we are very happy to welcome Dr. Ray Hall. He is a professor of physics at California State University in Fresno. His published research focuses on his work in the D0 collaboration, which was a 700+ member experimental particle physics experiment that was hosted in Fermilab, actually just down the street from where I grew up, which they helped discover the top quark, which is one of the fundamental particles of nature. And his current research centers on understanding best practices for teaching critical thinking and the methodologies of science and how to best assess student learning outcomes in these areas. He also shares his love for science and physics through his @PhysicsFun Instagram that has now nearly 200 followers. So we're going to get right into it and welcome Dr. Ray Hall.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and I'm delighted to be invited by CFI to participate in the Skeptics Toolbox. I'm especially Ray Hyman is a huge hero of mine, and I've seen him at other conferences, so to be invited to this is a great honor, and I thank you very much. Yeah, to kind of thank you for that wonderful introduction. And who am I? Well, I did spend a large chunk of my life working on experimental particle physics, and the other chunk I've been teaching at Fresno State. Well, since 1999, actually, it's been a privilege to be a participant at that university and that university system. Tell you a little bit more about that. And my main passions and the main things they let me teach to students there are physics, of course, but we also really take it seriously, the idea of critical thinking and teaching critical thinking to our students, along with rational skepticism was my take on what critical thinking means. And I also get to teach a class on the philosophy of science. All those, of course, are wrapped up in the skeptic community, and I've been involved with, first of all, TAM and the JREF for many, many years, and now lately, I'm delighted to be participating at the annual conference at SciCon in Las Vegas, which if you aren't familiar with that, I highly recommend joining that conference. She also mentioned that I do have a bit of a social media outreach, and a slight correction. She said 200 followers. Almost 2 million followers actually on Instagram, but that's a separate talk, and I'd be delighted to talk about that later. That's more of trying to get people comfortable and find science fun. And today I'd like to talk to you about this class that I've been teaching. We call it Science and Nonsense. It's a course that meets certain criteria for critical thinking. I'll say a little bit more of that in a moment. And so my experience is I've been teaching this class every year, 2 or 3 sections of it, each section having anywhere from 25 to 40 students. since 2000. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the strategies that I use, and then also about the strategies and investigation and whether my strategies work. Okay, so that's the two main themes. And to put this into context, California State University, Fresno is one of 23 California state universities, and we serve a population of about 450,000 students. And I'm pleased to tell you that the CSU system recognized in the late 90s that it's crucially important to teach critical thinking. This is actually our accreditation body called WASC, and it is one of what they call the core competencies. And so the way we address this in the CSU system is, first of all, we have a 3-unit course that all students must take to get their undergraduate degree. I don't know if other institutions, and by the way, these 23 CSUs are different than the 11 UC California systems that you've probably heard of. So we serve really a tremendous chunk of the population. This is our own university. For each of these critical thinking courses, our faculty body meets and decide what are the core learning outcomes that need to be accomplished if students take one of these G3 or G area, general education area courses. And you can see these requirements are rather succinct, maybe too narrow. Recognize, analyze, evaluate, and construct arguments in ordinary language. It's hard to argue with that. Distinguish between inductive and deductive reasoning. Well, that is crucial, but that's not the be all end all. It's kind of important to emphasize to students that almost all of our knowledge is inductive and the ramifications of that. Identify common fallacies of reasoning. I'm on board with that. That is a crucial core competency that they need to master. And finally, evaluate and analyze various types of evidence for various types of claims. Not the strongest, but I can get on board with most of that, but I'll have a little bit of a critique to say about the narrowness of this definition, because it allows a lot of things to serve as critical thinking courses that I don't think necessarily meet the goals. But let's go back to the course that I've been teaching and had a hand in designing. We call it Science and Nonsense. And so we do try to balance the nonsense with science. And I'll say a little bit more about how we approach that, but I'd like to start with kind of a little short list of principles. If you're going to try to be teaching or educating about critical thinking, especially the ability to tell science from pseudoscience, then one thing we've learned is that you must use examples of non-science and pseudoscience directly in your teaching. You have to directly confront these things. And so to that end, my students at the beginning of the semester will sign up to participate in making a presentation on the list of topics that you see here on the left. And we call these topics epistemically unwarranted beliefs. Now, you might say, well, why not just pseudoscience? We'll say a little more of that in a moment. But here, such topics as astrology, ancient astronauts. I'm afraid that show on the, I guess is it the Sci-Fi Network or History is still going strong, I'm afraid to say, aliens, UFOs, of course, aliens, dowsing, cryptozoology, some of the topics we might address in this, but we want to enlarge the banner. Some of the things we cover are believed without good evidence. And that's kind of what this maybe tortured term is, but epistemically unwarranted beliefs. Epistemic, just from the Webster's Dictionary, means of or relating to knowledge or knowing. Epistemology then, of course, is the study of knowledge, justification, and the rationality of belief. And pseudoscience is clearly falls under that. How do we tell science from non-science? The system of theories, assumptions, and methods erroneously regarded as scientific. But it's under a larger umbrella because, for instance, things like what happens after we die, people that claim to channel dead loved ones, they're not exactly claiming they're doing science, but they do claim to have evidence that they're offering that what they're doing is legitimate, even though it's not. It's terrible evidence. It doesn't meet the requirements. So we like this larger term of epistemically unwarranted beliefs, so we can also talk about 9/11 truthers and, for gosh sakes, QAnon and things like that, where conspiracy theories don't necessarily fall under the umbrella of pseudoscience. These are clearly important things where students should be able to use their rational capacity to discern, is this worthy of belief or is it not? And so we also allow the students to think about these. We have presentations on reincarnation, psychic mediums, and finally, really importantly, we cover some questionable medicine that's out there. And I'll say more about specifics in a moment, but yeah, we have the students look at these, analyze them, actually make a presentation to their peers on these topics, and that's the core of the class. Now, prior to a rigorous study, I had a essay prompt in our final exams. I was trying to just get a feel for, did the students change their mind at all? So this is not a scientific survey, but just a little bit of feedback that I was getting from the students on their final exam. And I was asking them, what topic, if any, has your position changed the most on during the course of the semester? And what is your new position, and explain the basic decision. And I put that on here. What did they change their mind? And they used to believe in it, and now they don't. And we see that we cover chiropractic, and we see a large movement on chiropractic, which I'm very pleased with. And that's what they said that they changed their mind the most on. But you can see the whole gamut. We had UFO believers, astrology believers, near-death experience believers. And so it seems that at some level, we have some feedback that we're being successful. But, you know, we're teaching critical thinking, we're teaching science, and it seems that we as teachers should apply science to see if our teaching is working, right? So we're going to kind of at the meta level, check to see if our techniques of teaching these classes, teaching courses about science and trying to discern science from pseudoscience, are our strategies working? And to that, my colleague and I, actually my wife, Katie Dyer, who also is a professor at Fresno State, we collaborated on a formal study that was completed in late 2017. And we call it a formal study of epistemically unwarranted belief outcomes. To do this study, we designed an inventory instrument that tries to assess how much a person believes in a particular topic. And we actually were able to get a rather large sample size of students on our campus. I'll say more about that in a moment, but it was 806 students that completed our inventory at the beginning of class and then completed it again at the end. And we looked for a difference in their answers. So this is the paper that came out of it. It was published in Research in Higher Education. I'll make sure that Jennifer has a link to that resource. And I'll say, I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of what we learned in this paper as part of my talk tonight. So the first thing is just to kind of show you a brief overview of our instrument. So it's 50 item survey. And in essence, what we do is we ask the students to evaluate each bullet point on a Likert scale of sorts, from sure it's false to sure it's true. And we have in the middle too, just, I don't know. So this kind of, if the student has never heard of the topic, hopefully that won't bias this instrument. To give you a flavor, we ask things about false science or science denialism, such as anti-vaccination movement. We also sprinkled through these 50 items, 10 of them, 1 out of every 5 is an actual scientific question. Do they understand that, for instance, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old? We put those in there to make sure we don't get what's called a response set, where people kind of figure out the answers to everyone should be no or sure it's false. So we pepper it with some other responses, expected responses. And then finally, we have your classic kind of pseudoscience, epistemically warranted beliefs, such as the government is hiding evidence of alien spacecraft at Area 51. So this is kind of the flavor of some of the questions we were asking and how we pose to the students with this instrument. Now, before I say more about our overall outcome, we do administer this survey before class starts and after. And so the pre-survey, it's exactly the same instrument, by the way, but the pre-survey, we were able to actually kind of assess what is the level of belief that our students have, and we can compare that to well-established polling services where you can kind of trust the credibility of the poll. So these are national US poll data from like Gallup and other credible institutions. And we're going to compare that to our sample of 806 students that we posed these questions. And we see something kind of amazing here. We see that our students are not really different from the general public in terms of their regard in accepting some of these pseudoscientific beliefs. Here you see really in line with national, we have A quarter of our students believe in Bigfoot. Half our students believe in ghosts, a little higher than the national average. 20% believe in ESP. Well, it's a little lower, but you can see that really on average here in putting these all together, we see that there seems to be no difference in the belief of our students than the general population. And this is a little bit worrisome for us because students, there's some criteria to get into our institution. They had to be decent high school students and have certain GPA standards, and they had to take slightly college-bound courses to get into Fresno State. So we see this preparation for college, and some of these students aren't freshmen. They are already in college for a number of years. So we are not the only ones to find this. In the literature, people have done some studies like this. We find that college students are similar to the general population. With regard to paranormal beliefs, or epistemically unwanted beliefs, unwarranted, I should say, well, unwanted too. So just getting a university education doesn't seem to vaccinate us from believing it's nonsense. And for me, that is so alarming to me. It seems to me that if a student, after finishing a 4-year degree at Fresno State, can't tell the difference between young earth creationism and evolution, we've really failed them. We've really failed them. So my passion's into this. So what does the research say? The research says that we'd like to believe education can stamp out nonsense, but it seems that college education does lead to some of that. Like, for instance, it's been shown that astrology is less believed by college educated folks, but some beliefs, there is no change. So telepathy, psychic healing, unfortunately, college graduates might have a larger propensity in believing those according to past research. So it looks like we have our work cut out for us. And this is just a little bit of the background of kind of what we're up against. So our initial study, our pretest seems to show us that we have some work to do to educate the students the difference between science and nonsense. So what can we do? Well, one of my favorite strategies is to convince students that they can be fooled. And there's a number of ways to do this. I have a number of interventions that I feature in the class participation. But one of my favorite comes to us from the great James Randi. This is the first place I saw it. I'm not sure who exactly invented it, but in essence, we're going to explore astrology a little bit. And of course, we lay out some background about astrology, but also, doesn't it seem to work, right? And so I survey the class. We have clicker instruments, ways to get direct feedback, especially when we're teaching online, we can poll the students. And I first get a sense of the class on, well, do you think astrology works? And you'll see, exactly like our pretested, about a quarter of the class chooses A, that it looks like astrology works. And even some are saying not sure. And then we get maybe, I don't know, a third of the class that says probably not. Then what I do is I have the students come up to the front of class and get a piece of paper that has their astrological sign on it. And they're an astrological profile. For instance, here's one for Virgo, okay? So here is a student would come up to the front of class and they pick up a personality profile, they take it back to their seat, each is labeled with their sun sign, and they're asked to read their personality profile and assess on a scale from 1 to 5, how well did it fit you? So if you're a Virgo out in the audience right now, go ahead and kind of take a look at this and see, and the other ones are going to be having a different title on the top. And then I'll have the students, I'll put this up on the screen and I'll have them rank it with their response device, or if we're from the home, I'll have them just answer a poll question. And 1 is a complete miss, didn't match them at all. 5, amazingly accurate description. And then we turn it back. And I've kept some statistics on this, and the answers are usually average out to about 4.2. Okay, so we have a few that say 1 or 2, but the majority of the students answer 3 through 5. And so most students feel this is a really good match. Now, of course, you may have seen this before. And it turns out that excerpt that I just showed you for Virgo, well, every single student was given this identical statement right here. Every single one of them was given an identical profile saying this is what astrology says fits you. And they all thought it was an excellent fit. And this goes, of course, back to the famous Bertram Foyer, who did a similar analysis. We now call this subjective validation. that humans, when you're handed information that's said to be about you, you are more likely to count the hits and ignore the misses. You'll also kind of think that there's more individuality in the world than there really is. We all have a great deal of unused capacity. We are all sometimes outgoing. We're all sometimes shy. But unless we recognize this, it's hard to assess that when we're handed this. So subjective validation and doing this in class, I actually have the students then take their personality profile and say, please hand somebody with a different sun sign. I actually have on a different colored piece of paper. I said, find somebody with a different color piece of paper and trade with them and read what their profile said. And it really is impactful. The students, there's a lot of laughing. They're astonished. It really, this kind of Gestalt experience, I think, sends a message home strong, and they remember this for the rest of the semester. So we teach them about these pitfalls that are well-known psychological pitfalls and biases that we have. I even have them form a list of what we have formally addressed these. These are mistakes in visual or audio perception or cognitive errors, such as this kind. And we make a list of those. There's about 8 or 9 that just happen so often that I want my students to recognize them without having to think about it too hard. And this is one of the skills that we exercise. If you don't know about this, it's featured in this fantastic NOVA program from the 80s. James Randi does it to a class. And I actually show this excerpt of James Randi performing this thought experiment with a class that was back in the 80s. And my students watched this with glee. It happened to them on the first day of class in my class. Later in the semester, they watched this, and it's rather astonishing how they react to it. They love seeing the prank pulled on some other people, and it allows you another opportunity to really send the message home. So that's one of the techniques I use in my class. To jump and just share one other technique before I kind of go into how we assess whether our techniques are working and really changing minds, is to give them a new tool. And one of my favorite tools, and this is one that really comes from science, is that one must always consider alternative hypotheses. So let's explore that for just a moment. So alternative hypotheses, let's go back to Bigfoot. Yeah, a lot of belief in Bigfoot, right? So here is a claim that Bigfoot ran up. You got these giant Bigfoot footprints. It's going up a very steep cliff. And, the Bigfoot proponents would say, look, the strength it would take to run with that gap of footprints up that hill is unaccomplishable by any human being. And you go, oh, that's interesting. Maybe that's some good, compelling evidence. But then we have this illustration by Daniel Loxton saying, maybe there's a better explanation, right? Maybe there's a better explanation. And so it's this kind of reveal that shows students how important an alternative explanation can be. A really important one is one when they think that you saw that in the Gallup surveys that people have actually felt, 25% of those polled felt that they had some kind of psychic experience. And usually they think of a psychic experience as an ESP connection with a loved one. For instance, you're thinking of your mother. The phone rings. It's your mother on the line. That's amazing. And the thing is, we have to recognize that rare occurrences do occur, but just not very often. And the background here is we have to assess how often does your mother call? How often do you think about her? And the fact that those aren't necessarily that infrequent. And so they're going to overlap at some level. But we have this tendency, another cognitive bias, that events like thinking about my mother and she doesn't call, or my mom calls and I just happen not to be thinking about her at that time. Those are not events that surprise us, and our brain is selective. Those don't get remembered at the same level as the events where it kind of surprised us, right? And so this is a well-known cognitive bias that we'll call counting the hits, ignoring the misses. And so here, my favorite thing to teach the students is, instead of being a conspiracy theorist, I would like you to be a coincidence theorist. Okay, so I coin coincidence theorists. I even give out little buttons. If they're a good coincidence theorist and they see coincidence, they can join the coincidence theorist club. Coincidence should always be on the table as a alternative hypothesis. Okay, so that's one of my favorite alternative hypotheses. And that can be explored in another way, where we don't see random events when we should, or we don't understand what random really means. For instance, there's streaks in basketball, and it turns out there's a fervent belief in the basketball community and all the way up to the NBA, where many players believe in the phenomena of being on their game and in the flow, and that their hand could be hot. And the main way they conceptualize this is if, to operationalize it, they would say, if I've made a shot or two shots, then I'm hot and I'm more likely to make the next shot. And if I've made a couple of attempts and both missed, then my hand is cold. And you can see how this might be an influence in the game. If everybody believes this and they think that if somebody has made a couple of shots is more likely to make the next shot than their shooting average, then you can see how that might be a strategy in the game, is to get it to the guy with the hot hand. Is it true, right? So it turns out Tom Gilovich, famous psychologist from Cornell, did this in the 1980s, and he looked at 76ers shooting data, and he looked at the data, and he calculated every basketball player's shooting average, and then he looked and said, if they made a shot, is the shooting average of the next shot after a made shot, is that shooting average higher than their overall average, which would mean that they were more likely to make the basket. He tried it for two shots after. And overall, the finding is published in this paper from 1985 that no correlation was found. Their shooting average does not change whether they've missed baskets, whether they've hit the baskets. It's kind of astonishing, but he says the analogy here is if you flip a penny 20 times in a row, and this would be a shooting average approximated by 50%, but so a penny has a shooting average of 50% coming up on heads. He showed that the statistics says that if you do 20 penny flips, there's a 10% chance of a 6 in a row, either fails or heads. A 25% of a 5 in a row. And what he says is that our statistics alone suggests things should clump together in streaks, but our minds don't want to accept it. And a little bit like this, which was featured in famous Stephen Jay Gould's book, Bully for Brontosaurus, he said, which of these two images is more random? And that's all he leaves it, more random. And it turns out that a lot of folks, given that prompt, would choose B. But it turns out A is the random, and B actually has an algorithm that says if they're too close together, spread them apart. And so it's less random. So this kind of thinking that clumpiness doesn't happen in nature, and that shooting 3 or 4 baskets in a row isn't just a clumping phenomena that random statistics should give us, is a cognitive error. It's called the clustering illusion. We don't believe things cluster. And Tom Gilovich makes the following analogy. You can see this top hat, and it turns out the distance from the bottom of the brim to the top of the hat is exactly the same size as the tip of one side to the tip of the other. And we can even perform said experiment. And so here, and I'm not doing any funny things with distorting the digital image, I actually have this on 2 transparency films, and you can pass them around and students can convey for themselves that indeed this is true. But now if I remove the proof, your eye goes back to lying to you, right? Even though I've just demonstrated fairly rigorously to you and convincingly, your eye and your brain continue to make the same error. And Tom Gilovich makes the case that cognitive errors are similar, that even though we can tell you that randomness would expect clumping, it's extremely hard for any of us, trained professionals or athletes, to accept that fact. And that is part of the problem. I couldn't recommend this book more highly. It's from the 1990s, and it's where I find most of my examples of pitfalls to share. Tom Gilovich, How We Know What Isn't So. One more final example. Let's go back to Bigfoot. Here you got the famous Patterson Gremlin film. When you film stabilize it, really kind of looks like a guy in a suit walking along. Again, can we say something from the one video? No. It's kind of sad that we haven't caught any more video now that we're all carrying around incredibly precise, high resolution video cameras in our pockets at all time. No similar footage has been caught just yet. Gotta leave it out there, provisional nature. But here are some alternative hypotheses I like to share with my students. Fantastic video you can find on YouTube, the New Jersey walking bear. This poor bear, it seems, hurt his paws when he was messing around with a barbecue or something in a New Jersey neighborhood. And he was literally walking on his hind legs everywhere. And it was freaking out the neighborhood. But boy, in the middle of a forest, bear walking on its haunches. This seemed like a good source for Bigfoot. The Bigfoot thing too, alternative hypotheses. Here, for instance, is a screen capture of this nice lady who claims that she has made it's a spray. So if you're a Bigfoot hunter, this spray will help attract Bigfoot, and you might get that video we've been so badly needing since Patterson and Grimlin grabbed theirs back in the 70s. And I love this part though. She said, "How do you know it works?" And she says, "Well, that's a tough question. I guess I could ask you, how do you know it doesn't work?" Teachable moment, right? Teachable moment for our students. Burden of proof on the skeptic, really a bad strategy. Again, Carl Sagan, we can invoke Sagan here. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But let's go back to alternative hypotheses. Turns out that she even gets a few more things wrong. She says field tests have been done or something. But here we got some counting hits of ignoring misses. That last time they had a sighting rather than 100 times without. These kind of things, you can give them alternative explanation of what's going on here and point out some of the flaws in their logic. But let's get to really, I think, sometimes the alternative hypothesis is sometimes more astonishing than the actual hypothesis on the table. So if our hypothesis is we're seeing Bigfoot, here's an alternative hypothesis that turns out to be true. A gentleman named McGregor, 36, has his own religion. He calls it Enkiduism or Enkiduism. It's from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's his own invented religion. And apparently there was some claimed Bigfoot sightings in the vicinity of where he happened to be camping and performing his shamanistic rituals. Well, it turns out, what is his shamanistic ritual? Well, he covers himself in beaver pelts and does some prayers out in the desert or out in the forest. And so people said, well, why don't you just speak up and say you're a human? Why did you run off into the woods pretending to be Bigfoot? And he said, well, that night, not too long after I started wandering, I ran into a couple of people a little ways away. I was not in a very heavily trafficked area, so I was surprised to see them, and they were surprised to see me. So I just turned around and left. He says, what was I supposed to say to them, right? But here is an alternative hypothesis for that big bear sighting. Turns out to be the best hypothesis at this point. We have to be careful and use Occam's razor and our tools. So those are a few instances of kind of some of the lesson plans that I would feature in class to hone some of these skills. So here's my class again. This is a kind of list of what my learning outcomes are. I want my students to be able to recognize characteristics of pseudoscience. I want them to be able to recognize those pitfalls of cognitive and visual perception. I call that evaluating the pitfalls and seeing if they're involved in the evidence evaluation. We do, of course, have some famous fallacies, and there are, of course, long lists of cognitive fallacies. I even have a little deck of cards, which are famous cognitive fallacies, but I've kind of honed the list down to these 16. If the students can recognize these 16, then I believe they'll find 95% of the errors, because these particular fallacies of logic crop up over and over and over again. So I'll make this available to you in a PDF format, and you can kind of ask me any questions you want to about that resource. I'll have some other resources for you available as well, but that's kind of my handout I give them about a third of the way through the semester, which is their little guide of evaluating claims. So that's kind of some principles, but notice our first principle here: must use examples of non-science and pseudoscience. And I'd like to convince you that we've done a study. We've actually performed a study to see if this strategy is effective in changing students' minds. And so here's our formal research questions on the topic. We want to know, like the class I teach, we're going to call pseudoscience instruction, where we actually use pseudoscientific topics as described and discussing them and showing the kind of alternative hypotheses there, oftentimes scientific alternative hypotheses. Can they reduce these? Also, can research method classes, we have courses where students learn the techniques of doing research, especially in psychology and other social science classes. And we have some courses that talk about study design and doing actual research questions. Can those classes reduce people's belief in things that aren't science? And couple of corollary questions. If we do find some success, are there areas of belief that are less likely to move? And are there demographics that are harder to convince? Are there students from different populations and diversity that are harder to convince about the pseudoscientific nature of things? So these are some of the questions that I'd like to share with you now. So especially to research point 2 here, there's a famous statement by Carl Sagan in his Demon Haunted World. He said, pseudoscience is embraced, it might be argued, in exact proportion as real science is misunderstood. And so, yes, if we educate them about science, does that reduce their belief in pseudoscience? So that's kind of does a research methods class work? So Carl Sagan, fantastic. I'm up to the challenge. Let's find out if that statement is true. That right there is a falsifiable statement. We can check to see if it's right. Okay, so just to remind you, we had 806 students, and we put them into different groups. Well, we had classes that had a certain amount of students in it. So we had 6 sections with 3 different instructors. I was one of the instructors, but we had 2 other instructors that were teaching a class with the same kind of structure and content, but somewhat different pedagogical uses than I did. But the main thing that we all agreed on is that pseudoscience must be directly addressed. So there was 203 students in those 6 sections with 3 different instructors. We had 7 sections with 4 different instructors of courses that taught about how to do research. We had 225 students that did the pre and post survey from those classes. And we also had a comparison group trying to be good science. We wanted a group where we didn't expect necessarily their beliefs in pseudoscience to change because they weren't really learning about these kind of topics or science. And so we had some GE courses that nominally didn't necessarily address this kind of critical thinking ideas as their core learning outcomes. And we had 378 of those. So 3 different groups of students, 3 different classes, all pre and post. What did we learn? Well, one more thing before we look at the results, and that is we did ask them about 40 different things that we feel people believe in without adequate evidence. And they're listed here. Everything from lucky numbers to crystal healing to GMOs are dangerous to ghosts, Ouija boards, things like that. Just kind of a fun selection of erroneous beliefs across the spectrum. But to report to you on 40 things didn't seem useful. So we did something that's often done in the social sciences and in any science where you have a large breadth of items that you're looking at. We use something called a factor analysis. And the factor analysis is based on some cool mathematics, but in essence, what it allows us to do is by looking at the results, we can compare how students' answers correlated with each other and other things and how they anti-correlated. And what we see is that we are able to group these 40 ideas, these 40 places where misconceptions happen often into 6 major groups, all right? So we have what we call paranormal, which is like things like crystal healing, extrasensory perception. We had religion-related ideas such as prayer, angels, faith healing, creationism. We had questionable health stuff as acupuncture, Mozart effect, homeopathy. Extraordinary life forms is what we call a group that involves aliens and Bigfoot. They just seem to correlate very nicely. If you believe in Bigfoot, you're kind of likely to believe in aliens as well. That might rise to the hypothesis that alien is actually Bigfoot is an alien pet, right? So we have conspiracy theories such as moon landing hoax, 9/11 conspiracies, and then finally ghosts and things like that. Now, doing the factor analysis was actually kind of insightful. We had initially thought we would group therapeutic touch, which is a modality used in medicine, which is kind of bogus, but it turns out it correlated much more with our paranormal, so that's where we put it. We also thought anti-vaccination should maybe go into the category of health-related pseudoscience, but it turns out it fell more under conspiracy theories, which at some level does make sense. So we left it there as well. So those were a couple of insights we got by doing this factor analysis study. More on that if you have questions. But let's just go with that. So we have these 6 main categories that we were able to lump these in. And these aggregates are a little bit now to let us tell you about what we found. All right, so let's go back to question 1 and 2. Can interventions, our classes, taking a class, reduce your epistemically unwanted belief in a student, right? So let's do the comparison group. So comparison group pre-post. Now each line here This is the Likert scale from 0 to 4. And 0 means not much belief, 4 means quite a bit of belief. And we see that they're all flat. So pre is on the left side, post is on the right side. And we can actually put this into some statistical analyses, something called ANOVA, where we compare the groups in a meaningful statistical way. And we get this p-value, which is an analysis of variance statistic that tells us how likely was this to be random chance alone, and helps us assess whether this is beyond chance. And we see nothing moved there and everything looks pretty normal there. We also assess and look for something called a partial eta. And a partial eta basically tells us about whether or not, even if there was some movement, was it a meaningful amount of movement statistically? So I'll say a little bit more about those in a moment. But what we saw is really no movement for the control group. Now, intervention 1, let's talk about the research methods courses. Now, these are courses that are instrumental in preparing our undergraduates to understand how to read and eventually, if they go to grad school, use research. Matter of fact, undergraduates do quite a bit of research in psychology. So these are courses to teach them the practices of science. Here, our research methods group, we see not much change, right? Here's the comparison group. We see everything's pretty flat. And unfortunately, we see that the research methods group did not have a great impact on how many beliefs or any of the beliefs that changed. We saw a tiny movement in one category, really, the paranormal category. But it's hard to say if that's too meaningful. And the movement was rather tiny by scale. Matter of fact, here's a little bit, if you're not used to looking at eta squareds, I kind of have to refer to this myself sometimes. Anything around 0.2 is small. 0.13 means a reasonable effect. And anything above 2.26 on this scale means large. And you can see the one small change in the paranormal here does not meet our criteria of even being a medium or large shift. So it seems that teaching science does not inoculate or even help people assess whether they have epistemically unwarranted beliefs. And so Carl Sagan seems to be not quite on the mark on this. It seems like just teaching students science is not enough. So that brings us to our other class. Do we have any success when we actually head-on address pseudoscience and epistemic? And I hope you're noticing that those curves are slanting rather dramatically downward. And when we run the analysis, it turns out, indeed, all across the board, every single grouping of aggregate epistemic unwarranted beliefs were reduced, and it seems meaningfully. If you remember, an eta size of 0.2 or greater meant a large effect. We see large effect sizes across the board and p-values way below what we would expect from chance. So this seems to be real. We really are moving students' opinions on these through our intervention strategies. So another way of conceptualizing this too is that we can say if they answered D or E on any of these, we could say that's belief. So instead of just looking at the continuum of their answers, we can say, did they believe it or did they not? So we'll call D or E belief, and the rest we'll say not belief, because if they don't know, they don't care, we'll say they don't believe. And if we characterize it that way, we can also state our findings thusly. We can say students in the pseudoscience instruction group believed in an average of 13 items on their pre-test. On the post-test, they only believed in 7. So at one level, you might think, well, there's still some work to do. There's no magic bullet in education. Can't eradicate all these views, but I'm going to take what we can get, right? So if we reduce down that many, there's hopes that later on they'll come to assess the other ones differently too. We can also ask what beliefs were most likely to change. And this we can get from kind of our statistics there. So our biggest change was in health pseudoscience. People were shocked when they heard about the details of chiropractic and when they really are shown what the chiropractors have to offer in terms of evidence and all the testimonial and the lack of published research in credible medical journals, that has a huge impact. But across the board, homeopathy, things like that, these strategies seem to work very nicely. We did see a big decrease in ghosts, extraordinary life forms, but as you can see, and troubling so, is conspiracy theories were the least likely. Those seem to be where the challenge is. Of course, they didn't seem to believe in them very highly in the first place, but to get them to reduce that, the few that are in there that have these beliefs, it's hard to persuade them otherwise. And we have our work cut out with us on QAnon and things like that, it seems, according to these results. Were we just teaching to the test? Well, we checked this. We had each instructor identify on the same epistemic belief scale which ones they directly covered in class and which ones they didn't touch on. And we did a comparison. And we saw that both covered and not covered beliefs were statistically significantly reduced. So it doesn't seem like they have to see the exact pseudoscience for them to trade over. We can say that for those that saw it in class, their belief was reduced double in magnitude to the topics that were directly addressed in class. So it does transfer. And finally, what kind of students are most likely to change beliefs? Well, we're happy to say that we didn't see any real strong correlations. Age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status were related to some pretest scores, but they were not related to the change score, which is kind of a relief to an educator, meaning I don't have to change my strategy depending on the group that I'm at. Political orientation, religiosity of upbringing were some other measures we took and compared. Current religious belief, we have a scale that measured curiosity, propensity towards lifelong learning, were related to some pretest scores, but again, none of those things, surprising to us, was related to the change scores, not religious affiliation and not political affiliation, which was pretty surprising for us. Academic indicators though, yes, the stronger the student, the better their GPA, the stronger some of those indicators. It turns out, yeah, those did better. They had bigger changes and they were less likely to believe it in the first place. So what can we say? So our conclusions of our study, to conclude kind of my talk almost, is we found that education works to reduce epistemically unwarranted beliefs. But the intervention must be targeted explicitly at these unwanted beliefs, at these epistemically unwanted beliefs. Students, it seems, do not know how to spontaneously or transfer their knowledge of methods without being shown that it should and could be done. Education seems to reduce all types of epistemically warranted beliefs, even those that are emotionally loaded. And all types of students respond to the intervention, sorry to say it, but especially the smarter ones, but not exclusively them. So let's come back to these learning outcomes and how do we assess it? Well, I really feel that our study shows that one way of assessing whether students have learned to use these critical thinking skills and learned to use them appropriately is we should be able to distinguish science, pseudoscience from actual science. We should just give them our inventory. And if they fail this inventory, or if they score high on believing a lot of things that have no warranted, evidence for them, then we know we've failed them as an institution. Finally, one last tidbit of something that I feel strongly in my teaching, start with less threatening topics and move gradually to more dangerous territory. What do I mean by dangerous territory? Well, if you're an educator, you kind of know what dangerous territory in pseudoscience looks like. So I always say, and I've kind of organized them here in a list, I have my students present and think about some of these earlier things. Ancient astronauts. Not a lot of students have any real emotional stake or any kind of worldview associated with their family on UFOs or astrology or dowsing, even cryptozoology, ESP. They're really not going to feel threatened if you show them that some of their beliefs on these are erroneous. When you get to the next level, though, what happens after we die, you're starting to get into some territory where people have some very strong emotions of this. I've had a few students that have had near-death experiences, and they like the interpretation that they've seen the other side. And I don't want to, I've just offered them alternative hypotheses, that this might be an hypothesis. There's alternative hypotheses available to describe the experience that you had that doesn't necessarily mean one that was paranormal. And so we'll hit those later in the semester when they're more attuned and they've seen the effectiveness of some of the tools we're teaching. Then we'll hit chiropractic and homeopathy. It turns out people are a little bit emotional about these kinds of things. Health practices, traditional medicine, these kind of things. Plus, they're more challenging to show the alternatives to. So they need a little bit more exposure to these tools. And we also have to teach them about reading research and things like that before we meaningfully can give them alternative hypotheses on those. And then finally, at the end of the semester, you can approach things like young earth creationism, right? And again, the chiropractic, homeopathy, I have students whose parents are often chiropractors, and they don't necessarily react really negatively. They're shocked, they're surprised. But if you approach this in this way where it's a gradual learning, you don't get that kind of emotional pushback that you might. And so that's my last tip. And so with that last tip, I want to let you know that our inventory of EUBs is available for your use. We used it in our paper. We've distributed it to some other researchers. So if there's an opportunity, you teach at the college level or at the high school level, and you'd like to be involved in a pre-post kind of thing, or just to assess your students where they're at, just as an assessment instrument for you, you're welcome to contact us, and we'll show you our thinking of it. We'll go over the most important parts of our paper and get that instrument to you. So I thank you very much for your attention and hearing me out on some of my strategies.
Great. Thank you, Ray. We have quite a few questions. Is it okay if I put your screen away so that people can see us a little bit better?
Yeah, let everybody laugh at my paranormal joke there first, and we'll just move on. Okay, thanks.
All right, so the first question, oops, I just minimized my questions. Is, yeah, you hit this very briefly at the end, but I was wondering if you could highlight this a little bit more, but have you weighted the results based on religious belief? They were wondering if non-religious students are indeed more skeptical or better critical thinkers than individuals who have deeply held religious beliefs.
So the answer is, well, it depends on how you're asking the question, but we actually had 2 survey instruments. So when we gave them our pre-test, we also had them fill out some instruments that helped us gauge 2 things. One was their childhood religious experience. And then we also had a measurement of religiosity, which measured things like how often do you go to church, how often do you read the Bible, things like that. And so those were our comparisons. And we found that those that ranked high on those religious indexes, either childhood religiosity or current religiosity, no, they did. Their change scores were just as dramatic. And even in the religion related topics, that was one of the most surprising findings that we had, is that that would have been a kind of a prejudice I would have had, a bias thinking, oh dear, this student's really religious, I'm not going to reach them. Our study seems to indicate, no, that's not the case.
Interesting. So just being a skeptic or being secular doesn't make you a good skeptic. I mean,
that's interesting. I'm not sure if I phrase it that way, but just being religious doesn't mean that you can't have your mind changed by presenting evidence and alternative hypotheses.
All right. So we all need to learn to be better critical thinkers. That's a very important thing, I think. So Daniel asks, I'm starting a career teaching general science in middle school. He's in LA. It appears I could teach much of this at their grade level. I believe they could grasp it, and it's the perfect age to introduce them to critical thinking. Are there subject matter related roadblocks or special things that you might need to consider for that age group?
Well, maybe. Okay, so the one thing about K through 12 that I don't have to experience as a college educator, and I don't have like rigorous groundings to say this. So this is a little bit more personal experience. I've put it out there, but I believe that you're going to get pushback from parents if you start stoking things like anti-creationism and stuff like that. That I think high school and grade school teachers might get more kind of pushback from parents. And I remember just anecdotally that some of my when my kids were in school and I went to the 8th grade, biology class. And she says, we cover evolution, but not the scary part. And so I had to wait after the meet the parents night and talk to the teacher and say, well, what did you mean the scary part? She says, well, human evolution, obviously, we don't cover that very much. We just go over it real quickly. And so that kind of feedback, I think tells me that maybe that there might be a little bit of a risk in broaching some of these topics. But a way around that is to talk about age of the earth. You know, how do our clocks, our radioactive dating techniques work? Convincing students that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, talking about the vastness of the scale of time. Those in themselves will then get the students thinking about people telling them that they're still 10,000 years old. And you don't even have to bring that up, right? So teaching that good science, but then you might have to bring up, yeah, well, there's people that claim the earth is 10,000 years old. But again, that shouldn't be the first topic you broach. My strategy would say at the end of the semester, once you've already integrated some of these other things, that might be safe. And then if you do the end of the semester, maybe you don't have to hear from the parents either. Last day of class thing.
There you go.
Your precious advice, apparently.
Right. Well, and this is just a general thing, but you and I talked about this when we had our initial conversation of, you know, what could we do if we could implement this as part of education all the way up? So we're not waiting until college, but as you said, you have to deal with the parents. But if it was something where it was just built into the curriculum, I wonder if there would be less pushback if it's just automatically talked about in every class, in every grade.
Well, there's so much that you could talk about that doesn't, again, interfere with that. And so you could, teaching the critical thinking, as we saw, I think our results seem to speak to that. So we saw that you could cover some pseudoscientific topics, and it turns out their belief is reduced in others. And so maybe just focusing on ancient astronauts, how likely is that? Not very likely. And alternative hypotheses for how the ancient pyramids were built and things like that. Or dowsing, does it work? And show the kind of tests, rigorous tests that have been done on dowsers and show that it doesn't work. Beautiful way to talk about what does it mean to have a falsifiable idea? How would you make and implement a test? There's a fantastic video from Scientific American Frontiers that features Ray Hyman along with Alan Alda, where they're testing a dowser in the most kind and gentle way, but he fails to do so. But their technique is rigorous. That would be ideal for a high school classroom to show how scientific tests are different than just going and looking. Yeah, so I think there's tons of room to explore and look at the importance of alternative hypotheses in a number of topics that wouldn't be controversial, I think, to most parents or the students. And if you build that understanding, they, I think, will transfer it on their own, and then you'll have better opportunities. Then my job's a little easier when they get to me in the college level.
Definitely. What resources would you recommend to individuals who are looking to improve their critical thinking skills? So this is coming from one of the attendees tonight. So at the adult level rather than kids at this point.
Well, I have to tell you, when I was a grad student, one of my favorite places to go was the Skeptics Dictionary. If I hadn't heard about some pseudoscientific topic, Robert Carroll, his legacy of the Skeptics Dictionary lives on. We lost Robert a few years ago to cancer. It's a huge tragedy to the community, but he offered so much. And I think resources like that, just Wikipedia and Susan Gerbich's attempt to get the critical thinking in there. Most topics you go and look at on Wikipedia are going to have a critical analysis associated with them. So at that level, that's the first go-to. The second go-to, well, it depends on kind of what your strategies are. That Gilovich book, How We Know What Isn't So, is one of my favorites because it's kind of like applied research. You get to see how he figured out these cognitive biases, and now we can use that research to inform ourselves against erroneous beliefs. So that's really nice. So there's so many things to read out there. What are the best ones? I guess I could file a Dr. Hall's favorite critical thinking reading list. I probably should think of doing that. But those are my first thoughts on the matter.
Well, how about you and I talk about that? Because that's something that we could very easily add to the resources page that we're going to be building as part of these new Skeptics Toolbox resources.
Sure. But of course, we should not forget to mention Skeptical Inquirer magazine.
Of course.
Resource. I mean, it's hard to know what's better than that. If you've discovered that and you're reading that, then you are at the upper level of people caring about this. And so, yeah, you're already there if you're doing that. But if you're meaning a deeper dive, then yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit.
And a good comment about the Skeptical Inquirer magazine, please check that out. We have both hard copy and digital copies of subscriptions available. And if you're a digital subscriber, they have both for Free Inquiry and skepticalinquiry.org. You can see pretty much the archive of the entire history of Skeptical Inquirer and Free Inquiry. So definitely we encourage all of our attendees tonight to check that out and to become a subscriber as well. So Eric asks, and we're getting close to 8 o'clock. Do you have a few extra minutes to do a few more questions?
Thank you.
Eric says, I think we have a real crisis of information, or more specifically, a crisis of information quality. We now have unprecedented access to information. How do we promote trust in better sources of information, and how do we evaluate those sources?
That is a deep concern. And it turns out that our university and our accrediting body, as I mentioned, that imposed this on us. I don't know of any other system like CSU that mandates a critical thinking course like we do. And again, I wish all of them were taught kind of at this level of addressing these questions. But this, in our parlance of education, is called information literacy, which clearly overlaps with critical thinking. I try to get the students to go out and consider their sources. That is a component of my class. I could expand on that actually and give a whole lecture on that aspect alone. I think what we're talking about is if they at least acknowledge or look at some of these ways of evaluating whether it's epistemically warranted, some of the techniques that just are in this class without diving into the whole information literacy thing, I think that has to put a dent in it. But yeah, we have to think about information literacy in a completely different way and how to educate our students. Now, some of my students do a pretty good job in terms of, at the end of the semester, recognizing when sources are questionable, because they see those things of offering non-falsifiable hypotheses. They see that all I'm getting on this chiropractic site is testimonial. Where's the research papers, right? And so at some level, this training is an information literacy training. But yeah, the fact that we have all this misinformation at our fingertips, well, we're seeing the damage of that right now, right? We're seeing kind of the fallout of that. And I think we just have to remain ever vigilant. The techniques we're using, I think, are effective even against that. And we just maybe have to up the ante a little bit.
This is a very interesting one. How is the field of neuroscience, and I guess you could add psychology to this as well, affecting our understanding of critical thinking?
Neuroscience. Well, I think there's our friends over at Science-Based Medicine that might be able to answer this question better than I. My field is particle physics. I know enough about psychology from my own lay reading to inform myself about what I tell people about cognitive biases and things like that. But I'm not sure I can speak to, can we use fMRI or something like that to probe our brains and tell the difference between non-critical thinkers and critical thinkers? Yeah, I'm not sure I really have the credentials to speak to them, but I would love to go to a lecture and hear about that. That's for sure.
Yeah, the one thing that stood out to me in some of the research for the resources that I'm developing is how non-critical thinking our brains are, specifically the cognitive biases that we all fall into naturally, that we actually have to train ourselves to avoid those pitfalls. So that's one of the things that I think that could be explored.
I usually have a bit more where I talk about that in my class, that these are habits of mind. We are trying to train our students to reassess what common sense is. We want them to have, instead of common sense, we want to have them educated sense or professional sense. We do that in physics. Our common sense about the universe actually is wrong. Things don't want to stay at rest or come to rest. They want to stay going in a straight line forever. Turns out our natural intuitions need to be retrained, but we can train physicists to have a new sense of the universe and have that new filter. And that is absolutely part of these kind of toolkits. That's why we call it a toolkit, right? They're like a series of filters that I love. People says we shouldn't be biased. well, no, we should be biased towards the best filters we can possibly assess, right? We should be biased. We should be biased towards using good logic. We should be biased towards knowing good evidence from bad evidence and being biased against bad evidence. Yeah. So we have to be careful how we even use those words, but yeah.
Very good point. Todd and Brent both had a related question. They found it fascinating that the smallest effect size was for conspiracy theories, smallest effect in change. Given today's environment, they say it's not totally surprising how intractable they are from the cure. Do you have a theory as to why these types of ideas are more difficult to change than the other categories?
Well, first, let's just also point out that they are less believed, at least. Okay, so we're starting kind of on a lower part of the hill, but those living there do seem to be more recalcitrant. And you know, I'd only be speculating, but one thing that kind of troubles me is that we've seen that religious and political beliefs don't seem to be correlated, including that group, the conspiracy theorists, and whether they change their mind didn't seem to be related to their religiosity or their political ideology. So I'd hesitate to put too much on that, right? It just could be we need a better way of kind of showing them alternative hypotheses. But yeah, I think we've had a couple of experts recently on some recent CFI talks talk about conspiracy theories. And so I would leave it to those experts more, but I could just say that our study seems to suggest that we can't necessarily make a simple statement like people of certain religious or political ideologies are going to be more likely to be conspiracy theorists. I think our results don't seem to speak that that's the case. There's something weirder going on, and I wish I had a better answer. So that's the wonderful thing about research is it often shows you at least what's not true, even if we haven't landed on what is the case. So it means it's an open question and more research needs to be done on this, and maybe urgently.
Yeah. Well, and I think if we get better at teaching people, as you have been outlining, to be better critical thinkers, that level of belief will start to go down across the board, hopefully, so we can reduce those beliefs in general.
Yeah. So. Will people seek the education, right? So there may be just those that aren't. We are not going to have an opportunity to have this dialogue, and so maybe part of it is how do we create opportunities for those that need to come to a toolbox, seminar? They don't even know they need the tools, right? Yeah, so that's the problem.
Very good point. Well, I just wanted to remind everybody that the video from this talk will be available on the website afterwards. There were many people asking if they were able to see that. They missed the beginning or had to leave early. So check those out. And Ray will be sending me many of the resources that he mentioned tonight. And we will be adding those to the website. The easy to remember URL for that is skepticstoolbox.org. The other link is also in the chat, and we will be including Ray's resources as well as many of the other resources that we are actually developing to list on that site related to many of these topics, and those will be available soon. Ray, before we close, did you have anything else that you'd like to say?
Oh, well, I just appreciate everybody tuning in and caring about this topic, and do reach out to me if you have further pursuits, or if you really are interested in implementing in the classroom. I'm there for at least some moral support as well. So I just want to thank everybody, and thanks CFI and Jennifer. Thank you again for the opportunity to talk tonight.
You're very welcome, and thank you for your generous time. And I hope that we can keep working together to get some more of these resources up online, because there's definitely an interest here. And like you said, some of the people we need to get these resources to the most are the ones that don't even realize it yet. So if we can help others get better at helping each other, I think we'll be in a better spot. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Ray, and have a wonderful evening. See you next time on March 9th to hear Anthony Magnabosco. Good night.